A lone, tattooed mage stands at a bend in a cave. Lumbering steps echo through the halls, shaking the walls in cracking stalactites. When the mighty dragon comes around the corner, Gargantuan's slitted eyes meet a grinning, arrogant composure. With a simple hand gesture, the mage closes his hands and says,
領域展開福間水す
And in an instant, the dragon is behind a wall of constant, invisible slashes, while a tiny bead of flame grows beneath them. The damage is small, but with every little cut, even mighty scales are torn asunder. With an even wider grin, the mage approaches this translucent barrier of slashes, opens his arms wide, and says,
風が
In a minute, a bead of flame turns into a roaring inferno, and all that is left behind is bleached bones. The mage looks on, and with a jaded expression says,
誇れお前は強い
If you've wanted to make a domain of your own without homebrew, just like Sukuna's domain, this video is all you need. Hello, I'm Teddy, and I have played D&D 5th edition for about 10 years now. I also make lore-accurate D&D characters on my channel. In today's video, we'll be going through the steps you need to emulate the domain expansion ability we see in the show Jujutsu Kaisen. To make your domain, we'll tackle the basics of preparing it. Then we'll figure out what effects you need to emulate, and finally come up with ways of refining those domains. Let's begin. If you want to prepare a domain, you can always flavor a single ability, like the Archfey Warlock's Dark Delirium, or an illusion spell like Phantasmal Force, as a simple domain expansion, but it doesn't make it justice. A domain in the show is a last resort that's very costly in resources. In our case, those resources will either be spell slots, money, or both. In the show, it is also a nearly guaranteed win, so in the game, we'll replicate it as inescapable damage, or a lot of buffs or debuffs for our opponent. Usually, it's very good to be prepared, so make sure that you lure a foe where you want them to be, and then unleash your domain and its full power with as many buffs, debuffs, or damage as you can conjure. For dramatic effect, you can also hold the action on casting your main spell for your domain expansion, and release it at a precise time, like saying a specific spell component, like a hand gesture, or if a foe decides to walk closer to you, or your friends. There are a few considerations to prepare an effective domain. First one is if you have one concentration effect, and then you want to add more instantaneous effects. This could, for example, be used to counter enemy attempts at domains, or to end a fight very quickly without much preparation. This way of handling domains is usually pretty simple and revolves around already easily reachable mechanics in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The next consideration, though, is if you have more than one concentration spell to emulate your OC's domain. This could also be called casting an instant domain. To do this, you really have two possibilities. Either you use the Glyph of Warding to store all your spells and refine the triggers to happen either when you say something or when an enemy steps in a specific area. Glyph of Warding is a spell that is available to 5th level bards, clerics, wizards, and divine soul sorcerers, 9th level artificers, and 13th level arcane tricksters and eldritch knights. Your other option will be to coordinate with other casters who have the spells that you need. Make sure everyone is holding their action properly, and when the enemy steps where you want them to be, unleash your domain in its precise order. The final consideration is actually a question to ask your dungeon master. Can you move glyphs that are placed inside a bag of holding? If yes, you can prepare your domains in advance, considering it a money and spell slot investment in your downtime. Hold them out as an action, and then use them on the next turn. This might take a few more extra turns, depending how many glyphs of warding you need for your domain, but you can flavor these as taunting your opponent, while they're setting themselves up for disaster. If you cannot move glyphs via bag of holding, make sure to tackle enemies and run if they cause too much trouble. Come back and trap them in your domain expansion that you spent some time preparing. You can also decide to ambush bosses, strong enemies, or maybe even entire platoons with your domain expansion if you so wish. For the effects of your domain, we have three questions to ask. The first one is your domain open or closed? If your domain is closed, you will need to restrict your opponent. Ask yourself if you want the effect or the barrier to break should you take a lot of damage. Essentially, which one are you holding concentration on? Some restricting spells include wall spells like Wall of Sand, Wall of Fire, Wall of Force, Wall of Stone and Ice, Wall of Thorns, and especially Force Gauge for higher levels. An honorable mention is also Prismatic Wall. I personally don't encourage it, since using it is a double-edged sword for you and your foes, especially if they can move you into it. If your domain is open, make sure that you still rely on at least some measure of movement debilitating spells like Plant Growth, Spike Growth, Grease, or Hunger of Hadar. The second question is, what is your domain's goal? Is it a debuff, a set of buffs, then locking you and your opponent in a cage deathmatch? Maybe it's a barrage of endless attacks or effects. Perhaps it could even be an illusory court proceeding or multiple summons in a singular area. Depending on the quantity of concentration spells, you might need Glyphs of Warding. Otherwise, you could could also drop a big concentration spell and have the glyph hold concentration on the barrier. Be creative and make sure to make good use of illusion spells to create fun and strange situations. Maybe work in additional effects with your DM. Additionally, spells that summon single controllable entities are good, but you could also use the conjure spells or the old summon spells to lock enemies in with actual monsters. Maybe you could even drop in a terrain that benefits them, like darkness for summons that have devil's sight. The third question is mostly dependent on your dungeon master. Usually these domains go for their full duration and do not end until then, but you could specify what are the conditions for the domain to end. You could dictate that the barrier breaks, maybe you become too injured, and willingly or maybe even forcefully end concentration. Or perhaps your domain reaches a conclusion. You dictate. Make sure that you ask your DM to include end conditions for Glyph of Warding, and this might even allow to make your domain have some drawbacks or ways an enemy can exploit it using roleplay or specific actions to have a way out. To further refine your domain, you almost always require Glyphs of Warding and some time. It's easier to do this if you focus your character on their magic. We could say they're focused on their cursed energy, or by being a full caster, like a bard, cleric, wizard, or divine soul sorcerer. There are many different ways to refine your domain, that they're largely dependent on your own resources, your party's resources, and what kind of enemy you're fighting. The simple ones are upcasting your main damage, debuff, or buff spell while inside your domain to benefit more people, to cause more harm to more enemies, or to make more enemies weaker, or make one enemy even weaker than they would normally already be. If your domain is closed, you could also make it harder to escape it by upcasting the wall or obtaining the Wall of Force spell, since it can only be destroyed via the spell Disintegrate. Additionally, you could also have better versions of your domain spells in higher levels. This means that you might need to put your weaker spells in Glyphs of Warding and cast that bigger spell using your own spell slots. Make sure you don't neglect the trigger conditions for your Glyphs of Warding. As a fourth tip, you could also protect yourself from your domain's effects if they could hit you. For example, you could be an Evocation Wizard, or eventually grab the Globe of Invulnerability, which could mimic Hollow Wicker Basket, or even a simple domain, to ensure that you pass your domain's debuff save or get entirely unaffected by its overwhelming damage. As even spells that last minutes, as long as they're in the Evocation School, doesn't matter if they last 1 minute or 10 minutes, the Evocation Wizard and the allies that have been designated do not take damage from it. And lastly, you can ward off additional means of escape and add specific reinforcements against magic. Some of those spells include Silence to stop any form of verbal spellcasting, Magic Circle to stop and hinder specific kinds of creatures, Mordenkainen's Private Sanctum to almost act like an actual domain barrier, but without the physical stopping, Hallow and Forbiddance for those cleric friends who also want a domain, and finally Force Gauge to really stop any form of travel with a singular spell. These can be stored or cast ahead of time. This is especially prevalent for Private Sanctum, Hallow, and Forbiddance because of their extremely long, if not infinite, durations. Feel free to add anything you like within your domain, possibly even bringing your allies in with you. You can flavor this as granting them protection to the effects of your domain, or instructing them to act a certain way upon entering. And that's it for this quick little video on casting a domain expansion. I hope you are now motivated to get out there and figure out your OC's domain all on your own. This can be a costly strategy, but with refined triggers, clear wording, some gold, and your dungeon master's blessing, you can master domain expansions all on your own. A wholehearted thank you for you all watching this little video, and make sure to drop a little subscribe if you want to see more lore-accurate D&D content. Additionally, and importantly, I want to thank you, my supporter on Coffee, Farstool, otherwise known as Elevator. I seriously appreciate the endless support you bestow upon me to allow me to keep doing this silly little D&D content. Thank you a lot. Be well, friends, and see you on the next one. Bye-bye.